Star Trek Voyager is one of my favorite shows of all time. To me, it was always Next Generation, but better. Better characters, more interesting themes, more nuanced approaches to a lot of the conflicts of the day. God, I love this show. I love Next Generation, and it's certainly my top 10, but Voyager is number 1. Sadly, it seems that for the longest time, a lot of people have just not felt the same way. When I hear people talking about Voyager, all I can hear is the same few complaints, repeated over and over again. You know what? Fuck it. I'm in a discoursing mood. Let's get ourselves into trouble. The biggest complaint I see about Voyager is that the show is bad because every episode the status quo is restored and the ship is back to being in pristine condition. Now, continuity has been the monkey on Star Trek's back for a very long time. For years, fans wanted it, and they've huffed and moaned whenever Star Trek didn't give it to them. Yet conversely, Star Trek is always worse off when it does foray into long-term continuity. Star Trek being an optimistic series about the day-to-day life of an enlightened race of explorers has always favored the more isolated, episodic approach to storytelling, where you can have lighthearted and heavy episodes in equal measure. Voyager was probably the best in this regard. While Deep Space Nine was racking up the faceless, meaningless civilian body count with the Dominion War, Voyager would materialize a brand new character, spend an entire episode getting to know and appreciate him, and then have him beg to be allowed to live while Janeway fixes the transporter accident that created him.
Holy shit. Janeway didn't mess around.
Voyager can be pretty hardcore at times. In fact, I'd call it the darkest Star Trek series to ever exist. While latter Star Trek series could ramp up the gore and bitter cynicism, it doesn't do this with very much to say. Voyager engaged in the kind of ethical discussions that the Enterprise D would have shut down immediately, and more importantly, it actually had the stones to carve out a stance. However, it was also a very traditional Monster of the Week series, and that just breaks nerd brains. Steve Shives is a Star Trek YouTuber, and I cited him in a previous video actually. He discussed what his problem was with Voyager, and the thing he got stuck on completely was the lack of continuity. Episodes aren't called back to all that often, even if something significant happens to the characters, and he makes the remark that it doesn't matter how good the episode is because the lack of continuity makes it pointless. I don't mean to rag on this guy, he's pretty smart and his videos are great, but it's an extreme disservice to the quality of the writing to suggest that some of the best episodes of Star Trek, hell of television ever, don't count because they aren't referenced or called back to enough. And this is something a lot of people get really stuck on. Get someone talking about Voyager long enough and they will circle back to the lack of continuity and stay there like a discourse version of the Collatz conjecture. This is especially odd since Star Trek is a very old property. It's from a time period where this was expected and nobody had an issue with it before then. Some of the best episodes of Next Generation had no follow-up until years later, if they even got that. The Inner Light is cited by many people as the best episode of Star Trek, period. Or at least by people who appreciate what Star Trek is and not what they wish it was. It's an episode where the Enterprise encounters a probe in space that puts Picard into a coma for half an hour. During that time, he experiences the life of a scientist on a long-dead world by a long-dead people as they come to grips with the fact that their planet is dying. Picard experiences a full 42 years of life on the planet before the probe shuts down and he wakes up on the Enterprise. Having lived 4 decades of his life, he was starting to believe that the Enterprise was a dream and has to readjust to being on the ship again. But more than his readjusting to being on the ship is the reason why this happened in the first place. The Resicans sent out the probe so someone would know they existed. Someone would be able to tell their story with the intimacy and truth of having lived it. They do this because their sun went supernova 1,000 years ago. Their entire culture was wiped out completely just because they had the misfortune to evolve at the end of their sun's natural life. During Picard's time under the probe's influence, his life had changed. His outlook had changed. He had come to value his family, his wife, his children, his grandson, and now they're all gone. All that remains of them is this one flute, the song he spent years learning to play, now little more than a dirga for a home he can never again return to. A few months ago, I had showed my patrons who had never seen Star Trek before this one solitary episode, and it made all of them very emotional. They knew these characters only through pop culture osmosis, and yet it hit them as hard as it hit everyone else. This episode is called back to only twice. Once several seasons later, when Picard shares the story of what happened in that probe to a woman he plays music with, and then later in Star Trek Picard while they're rattling off a list of fanboy nostalgia. But it's also indirectly called back to in Star Trek Generations, where upon entering the Nexus, Picard is shown to have a family of his own, something he has been yearning for since his experiences with the Resican probe. Picard's experience on Catan had a profound impact on himself. It altered how he views life, especially after coming out and realizing he'd been given a second chance at it. But one of the reasons it doesn't come back often is pretty simple. Picard is a person who is emotionally closed off. He doesn't discuss things like this with people very often. In fact, him discussing it with anyone and what the flute means to him is a sign of serious emotional vulnerability, which is why the writers held on to it until Picard met someone he could be that vulnerable with. Conversely, there are things Star Trek keeps calling back to, often to their detriment. Picard being assimilated by the Borg is something the franchise literally cannot stop calling back to over and over and over again, to the point they made an entire fucking movie about it, and it's cheapened the experience because after a certain point it's just, hey, remember the Borg? Remember them? Let's bring them back over and over again. They even do this as far as Star Trek Picard, which is especially problematic because the Borg as a threat ended completely at the hands of Captain Catherine Janeway, Science Queen of the Delta Quadrant. So they have to keep manufacturing ways to keep the Borg around anyway and undercutting what is probably one of the coolest moments in the franchise.
Must be something you assimilated.
Let's be honest, the Dominion only felt comfortable going to war because Janeway was on the other side of the galaxy. Deep Space Nine as a whole is something of a weird child among classic Star Trek series. It's the harshest and most bitterly cynical, and the whole series has this brown haze over most of it. Occasionally it would do something interesting, like revolutionize the Ferengi or give you a Cardassian who isn't a genocidal space fascist. But that was something that was common in other Trek series. Being set on a stationary, station meant it could rarely ever move beyond the confines of Bajor, but it was a predominantly serialized show in an area where that just didn't happen outside of soap operas. And as we moved on to the 2010s, where this was the holy grail of all fandom, Deep Space Nine was held up above the rest as some example of Star Trek growing up from the perspective of an edgy teenager. So Voyager airing both after and alongside it, with the Dominion War happening at the same time that the Doctor is curing the ship of a cold it caught from some cheese, left a lot of fanboys very cranky, which is why Voyager gets put under the kind of scrutiny that other Trek series just don't, because it aired alongside Deep Space Nine. And also there's a woman in the captain's seat. There's a two-part episode called Year of Hell, where Voyager is constantly under attack by the Krenim, and spends a year getting progressively more damaged, crew end up dying, the ship is in shambles, Tuvok is blind, and everyone's miserable. It ends with the time ship being destroyed and resetting everything. It's a very good episode and quite effective at what it wants to be and do, but it's effective because it was just an episode. One thing Trekkies lament is that Year of Hell was supposed to be an entire season. However, when they pitched that to the executives said,
"Are you out of your fucking mind?"
Year of Hell as an entire season would be utterly bleak, utterly miserable, and so unlike Star Trek that it would read more like edgelord fanfiction, the Star Trek equivalent of My Immortal. Given that the entire plot is about one man trying to unerase his wife, there just isn't enough story to sustain an entire season, not the way the rest of the seasons do. Year of Hell is a good story about the way in which our devotion to one person can lead to us causing great harm, not only to ourselves, but to everything and everyone around us as Anarax wipes entire cultures out of existence in an attempt to undo his own mistakes. And the only reason people wanted it to be an entire season is because of the damage Voyager suffers. If it had been an entire season, it would have been fucking awful. Even Voyager's setting favored episodic storytelling. You can't travel through an entire quadrant with multiple civilizations, passing through their territory over the course of 7 years on what's supposed to be an 80-year journey, and keep the same narrative plot running the entire time. What's it gonna be? The Kazon? We left them in the dirt once we folded space-time in half and jumped across the crease. What this all amounts to is a refusal to appreciate Voyager for what it is, rather than some pipe dream of what it could have been. All the evidence in retrospect tells us that a serialized Voyager with the ship in shambles by the end would have sucked. The people who wanted it went on to make shows that suck. The Trek series afterward that gave you exactly what you wanted sucked. And it turns out that there was a reason they kept getting shut down by both the executives and other creatives, because their idea sucked. The problem comes down to fans treating episodes of TV like investments instead of experiences, where if they're not rewarded for investing their time with reference after reference after reference, then they get bored and leave. I don't need the Inner Light or the Shoot or Tuvix or Mortal Coil or Jetrel or Lower Decks or Chain of Command or Measure of a Man or Latent Image to be referenced or affect future storylines to enjoy them and remember them fondly, because what they make me think about and feel are still important outside outside of their future reference. When you treat episodes as only mattering in the effect they have on the story, first you lose sight of the themes, but you end up in this constant Skinner box where you're just chasing the point, where the show rewards you for remembering something by mentioning it. We treat RPGs the same way, calling them reactive when you pick an elf and the character goes, "Hello, you are an elf," while getting upset when an RPG with a more poignant theme ends up being less reactive as a consequence despite being better. And after a certain point, there's no nice way to say this, after a certain point you're just being a baby, refusing to engage with something because of surface level attachment to something that doesn't matter. Some people think it's silly that the ship can get trashed one week and be in pristine condition the next week, but it's Star Trek. It's philosophically profound, wise beyond its years, deeply sentimental, and it's also very silly.
I protest. I am not a merry man.
If your biggest issue with Voyager, and I mean biggest issue, not only issue, is that it has no continuity, you are calling Voyager the best Star Trek series to ever exist. You are putting it above Next Generation. If that is the biggest flaw of the series, then the show is flawless. Which it's not, by the way. Look up the consultant they hired to help write Chakotay, or ask Garrett Wang how he felt about how his character was treated, or both Kate Mulgrew and Jerry Ryan how they felt about their ratings being saved not by the amazing writing, but by putting Ryan in a Counselor Troy-esque jumpsuit.
Then you wish to...
There are plenty of problems with Voyager, but they don't get talked about as much because a lot of people who watch it are so stuck on the continuity that they just won't engage with anything else. There are entire episodes where the Prime Directive is interpreted in such an extreme that Janeway lets people die when she could easily prevent it from happening, and then shirks it like crazy at the next episode. The writers seemed unable to decide if Janeway was a paragon or a renegade, and so flitted back and forth between them with no rhyme or reason. There's the entire relationship between Tom and B'Elanna, which is mostly characterized as Tom blowing her off, while B'Elanna is portrayed as a nag for objecting. It's just unpleasant most of the time it's on screen. Hell, the character of Tom Paris, period. He has some genuinely great character moments, but they're bookended on all sides by him acting like a fucking Dragon Age character. I'm like the only person in the world who has a fondness for Chakotay, but if you didn't already know the consultant was a fraud who drew from Hollywood stereotypes, one of the more native-centric episodes of Voyager would immediately give it away. When you aren't in one of those episodes, you get a contrasting foil to Commander Riker, where Chakotay is a lot more professional than Riker would ever be. When you are in one of those episodes,
trapped on a barren planet, and you're stuck with the only Indian in the universe who can't start a fire by rubbing two sticks together.
And it's a shame the writers keep doing this because I actually think Chakotay is a very strong character.
You won't stop me from earning my name, Federation.
Not Federation. Chakotay. That's my name.
Did you have to earn it?
No, not exactly.
Then your name means nothing.
My name was a gift. From my tribe. I cherish it. Every day of my life.
I think this one moment says something interesting about the fundamental difference between the Kazon and the humans. A name, the most fundamental aspect of personhood, is earned by the Kazon. You must earn your place as a member of the community. You are given nothing, and you must earn everything. Conversely, on Earth, the fact that you exist is enough to be welcomed into the community. Your place is not questioned. You are welcomed and celebrated. The anniversary of your birth is, quite literally, a cause for celebration. You have to earn many things in life, but your place in the community is not one of them. It's something Star Trek can put into a small scene in the middle of an episode, yet can make the most cynical bitch sit back and smile. Chakotay's presence on Voyager also meant that spirituality as a concept was handled with a lot more tact than it usually is on Star Trek.
Millennia ago, they abandoned their belief in the supernatural. Now you are asking me to sabotage that achievement, to send them back into the dark ages of superstition and ignorance and fear? No!
Chakotay's presence on the show opened up something that Star Trek had previously been completely apathetic towards. There's an entire episode where Neelix is dead for 17 hours before being revived by Borg technology, and he has a severe crisis of faith because he didn't see his people's afterlife. He seeks help from Chakotay, but the experience shakes him so completely he tries to commit suicide, and Chakotay has to talk him off the transporter. Neelix's crisis of faith is treated with respect, where any other Star Trek series would have rolled its eyes at how primitive such a thing as a belief in the afterlife would be. This episode is a particular favorite of mine as somebody who has battled with nihilism and suicide in the past. But because the writers kept dropping the ball with Chakotay, a lot of his best moments, of which there are many, are forgotten. And since Voyager isn't sincerely engaged with by Trek fans, this is all they know of him, and I feel that's a damn shame. So everyone says that the worst episode of Star Trek ever made is Threshold, an episode where Tom Paris breaks the transwarp barrier, hyper-evolves into a lizard, has an existential crisis, kidnaps the captain, evolves her into a lizard, and then has babies with her on a random nowhere planet.
Captain, I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. I don't remember very much about...
What makes you think it was your idea?
Is Threshold the worst episode of Star Trek? No, that honor goes to Code of... honor. A hyper-racist, hyper-misogynistic episode of the ostensibly progressive Next Generation that has to be seen to be believed. A closer runner-up is all the episodes that involve someone being forcibly impregnated. Retrospect is probably another episode that gets brought up a lot, with some people claiming it's anti-Me Too, though the actual reason as to why is never clear. Retrospect involves Voyager dealing for new equipment. 7 of 9 is assigned to work on installing the new equipment with the dealer, but after a minor argument, he tries to move her out of the way and she attacks him, seeming to be unusually distressed. At a later examination, 7 is tense and shifty, and something is clearly wrong with her. Attempts to give her an examination prompts strange flashbacks, and she panics. Not even 7 understands what's wrong, so the doctor attempts to discover what's wrong by using recovered memory therapy, a procedure that was scientifically discredited about 400 years before this episode takes place.
We don't use scalpels or leeches anymore.
The memories recovered suggest that Coven and 7 were working on adjustments to a rifle when he turns the weapon on 7, straps her down, extracts nanoprobes from her body, and uses them to assimilate someone. Then she blacks out and is back in the lab with a minor burn and asks for a dermal regenerator. This is where the claims of being anti-Me Too break down.
7 has made serious accusations, and I won't dismiss them. If Coven assaulted her and took a sample of her Borg technology, we can't stand by and do nothing.
The Me Too movement is about believing women when they come forward with accusations of abuse. Not only does Janeway believe 7, she believes 7 so hard that she involves the local authorities and engages in joint investigations in the process. Not something you would do if you don't believe someone. In fact, here's how hard she believes 7.
Are you willing to risk our trade agreement all on the basis of one crew member's delusions?
Yes.
The doctor takes 7 completely at face value and insists on Coven's guilt, attempting to make any statement for witnesses, even ones that contradict 7's accusations, into some kind of smoking gun, while Coven insists that 7 is maliciously lying out of spite. Neither of these statements are true, and the episode ends with us not knowing what really happened. None of this is helped by the fact that Coven comes from a culture without due process, where even an accusation is a serious offense, leaving him disinclined to cooperate. All they have to go on are memories that had to be coaxed out of 7 by the doctor. This is what the episode is actually about, by the way. The myth of repressed memories and recovered memory therapy was something of a plague in the 90s, and today is regarded in the same way we regard the lobotomy. This is what gives 7's story a level of doubt, especially as the crew continues to investigate and finds nothing conclusive. In the end, the only person hurt is 7, who now has to deal with memories that may or may not be real. The fact is that the crew do exactly what they're supposed to in this situation. It seems to be that some people believe the correct response would have been to charge and convict Coven on 7's word alone, even after finding strong evidence to the contrary, which is just completely fucking irrational. I know some people actually believe that's how you should do things, otherwise you're not believing victims, but that's not a coherent thing to say. That's just how Twitter goblins emotionally blackmail you. It's not the behavior of someone with multiple doctorates serving as an astronaut on a starship. So no, the episode is not anti-Me Too, and anyone claiming otherwise is just being very fucking foolish. It seems that any episode dealing with heavy subject matter that's either a little heavy-handed or ends in a way that's deliberately unsatisfying tends to be one that's put on the chopping block. Voyager often gets crap for emasculating Q as well, but I feel like TNG had already emasculated him plenty, what with the whole dropping him on the Enterprise and making him beg for forgiveness bit. Q's appearances on the other shows always carried this air of filling time as Picard barked at him while Q wasted time on non-sequiturs. On DS9, he shows up acting like a clown to a man who makes Spock look like a manic pixie dream girl. Even Picard's interactions with Q are little more than stonewalling and telling Q to fuck off. His best lines with Q are,
"I would have taken my own life, but for you."
We all make mistakes.
Q's appearance on Voyager typically carried more weight as they involved the inherent clash between the continuum and humanity, as well as the consequences of a god ending its own life. And Janeway's dialogue with Q was always a lot more biting and a lot more interesting. Q would often chase after the captain of the show with bright eagerness and a raging stiffy, and Janeway was the only one who would hit him in the balls with a pipe wrench. Maybe this is just because I find Q overrated, but Q showing up on the Enterprise or DS9 was like finding a cockroach in the kitchen. Mildly annoying, but some silicone to a crack in the wall will fix it, no problem. But Q showing up on Voyager is treated as a bad omen that has the crew anxious as to what's going to happen next, and I feel like that handles Q a lot better. Despite all of this, response to Voyager has softened over the years, particularly because with the release of Enterprise, the Abrams films, and New Trek, Voyager was the last Trek series to really be Star Trek until the release of Strange New Worlds, and even Strange New Worlds is still kind of struggling with the whole professionalism thing. There's a deep irony in Voyager being primarily derided for not having a serialized continuity and not being as dark as it could have been, when every attempt to make Star Trek into that kind of series has turned out turd after turd after turd. So when I hear Trekkies still complaining that Voyager lacked continuity, all I can hear is them wishing the show was terrible. It's this attitude that being serialized and continuity driven is objectively better in every possible way, despite the fact that there has so far been no example of an episodic series becoming serialized that actually proves this, and many examples to the contrary. I'm CD Call, and thanks for watching.